8,536 people are experiencing homelessness in New Jersey on any given night. Around 2.3 million people in the United States were evicted from their homes in 2016. And it's estimated that 815 million people around the world are suffering from undernourishment. But who cares? We can't conceptualize, let alone relate to, a statistic like that. If you don't mind, I want to try something. I want you to close your eyes and imagine a room with 10 people. Now imagine a room with 100 people. A room with 1,000 people. 10,000 people. 100,000 people. Imagine a room with 100 million people. Got it? You can open your eyes. You probably noticed that at some point, every zero you add becomes meaningless. Your brain literally can't process it. So those statistics I just showed you might be daunting, but they're also empty. There's a great quote from a 1916 newspaper called The Blast that summarizes this problem. It reads, "There is double the pathos for us in the death of one little New York waif from hunger than there is in the death of millions from famine in China." The author concludes that the mind is unable to grasp a suffering in the gross. Suffering is so intimately personal a thing that it must be explained through the personal equation, if at all. This is Diane. We met this summer and quickly became friends, as you can see. She's loving and warm and kind, loves to sing and dance. She's got a bachelor's degree and 2 master's degrees in English literature and English language. She had dreams of becoming a teacher one day, but she faced some serious adversity that threw a wrench in that path. Diane may not seem like your typical candidate for homelessness, but she ended up living on the streets for 4 months, during that time facing even more violence and trauma. Her story is only one data point in the statistic, but her story is why those numbers matter. I want to share with you a few stories of my journey through service so far and how conversations with people on the street have changed my perspective on how best to address social issues. When I was in high school, I became really passionate about social justice. I attended a 3-week program at UC Berkeley focused on civic leadership. We would spend a few days in the classroom each week talking about social issues and their root causes, and then a few days in the community actually doing service. And it was a great model. I learned a lot. But the most educational experience I had at that program lay outside of the curriculum entirely. Students were housed in a dorm building that overlooked the city of Berkeley. You could see out my window a view like the view of any city, full of movement. The fog rolling in the background, cars driving down the hill, people walking by. But there was one thing in that frame that was unmoving. There was a man sitting on a bench on the street corner across from my dorm. He was there every morning when I woke up, every afternoon when I walked to class, and every evening when I looked out on the city before going to bed. And I assumed pretty early on that he was homeless based on his disheveled appearance and the fact that he'd been there the entire time. But I also started to feel a connection to him. I began to wonder who he was and how he'd gotten there. And so eventually on one day on my way to class, I brought him an apple and a bag of chips, and I wished him a good day. And I continued that tradition for a few days until around the second week when I approached him with a few of my friends. At that point, I was already familiar with his layers of coats, the deep wrinkles in his face. But this time I formally introduced myself. Hi, my name is Remy. I'm a high school student attending this program right across the street. I've seen you here every day. And then I asked if he would share his story with me. His name was Devin. He'd lived in Berkeley his entire life. He had 2 siblings, one in Pittsburgh, one down south. His mother was hospitalized at the time we spoke. And he said he'd worked in sales until he was laid off during the 2008 financial crisis. He'd been homeless for 3 years. But he loved the area he sat for its peaceful and quiet nature and for the people who would bring him food and talk to him. Walking away, I reflected on our conversation, and I was struck not only by his gratitude in the face of adversity, but also by how little that fact that he'd been homeless for 3 years defined who he was. By placing a label on him so early on, I denied him the right to define himself, to tell his own complex and beautiful story. After that experience, I visited Devin a few more times, including once with my class. And before I left the program, I decided to write him a letter. In the letter, I thanked him for sharing his story and also for teaching me something really important. Devin taught me that home is not defined by physical limitations. Home can be a mansion on a hill or a hut on a beach or even a bench on a Berkeley sidewalk. What's important is that home is where you find a community and learn to appreciate the world around you. And that's exactly what he'd done on that bench. That experience showed me the importance of understanding the stories of the men and women who sit on street corners. And it inspired me to share those stories in hopes of creating an understanding of their humanity that reaches far deeper than social status. It also reminded me that while I was spending hours a day in a classroom talking about issues like homelessness, living proof of their effects were sitting right outside my window. All I had to do was open my eyes. Devin taught me that real change begins not by recognizing how big a problem is, but by recognizing how close it is to all of us. We've all walked past people holding up signs on street corners. Homeless vet, hungry, anything helps. Some of us have pitched in money, maybe some food even, but we rarely get to know the lives behind that cardboard. Over time, I've realized how important that pursuit is to the way we do service. Imagine you're walking down a crowded city sidewalk and someone approaches you and asks for directions. If you know where to point them, you probably will. Now imagine you're walking down that same sidewalk and someone nearby falls over and cries out for help. You'd probably feel compelled to rush to their aid or call 911 or at least alert other passersby. So why is it that our demeanor changes so much in the face of homelessness? We see people suffering immensely, going through crises we can hardly imagine, and we're able to walk by without a second thought. We don't often stop to consider how we can help them before assuming that we shouldn't or can't. Well, I want to propose that we should and can, but not in the way you might think. In order to contribute to a more empathetic society, you can contribute in small but meaningful ways. You don't have to dedicate your entire life to service. It might mean as little as taking a few minutes out of your morning and stopping to talk to the woman you pass on the way to work every day, finding out her name, asking her how her day is going. What could be a small deviation in routine for you might mean the world to someone living on the street. When we stop and take the time to connect with these people, changes can happen in their lives and in ours. There was a moment during my internship this summer where I was walking back to the office from lunch and I noticed a man sitting on a street corner across from me. He was drumming, and I decided to approach him. Once I got near enough, I noticed he had long blonde hair and wrinkles in his face, like the ones I'd seen in Devin's face. And I told him I was a drummer too, gave him a Starbucks gift card, and then I crouched down next to him and I asked him if he would tell me about himself. Greg was 60 years old when I met him. He said he'd been drumming since age 6. He was in a band in San Diego in the 80s. He definitely had the hair for it. And he attributed the situation to a specific incident. He'd been hit by a car, disabled, had been able to collect proper compensation, and had ended up on the streets. At the time, his family was all dead, so he had no support system. And since then, he'd been on the receiving end of discrimination from police, passersby, and fellow musicians alike. He said he tried to join a drumming circle, but had been pushed out. He talked about the criminalization of homelessness and corruption in the police force. And he said that complete strangers would encounter him and assume right off the bat that he was crazy or dangerous without giving him the chance to speak for himself. After our conversation, Greg said this: "Thank you for hearing me." Walking away, I knew that he needed a lot more than a $10 Starbucks gift card. He needed a roof over his head, a sustainable source of food, a new set of clothes. But he also needed to be heard. He had decades of stories and emotions and experiences to share and most of the time, no one was there to listen. Think about all the people you talk to in a day. Now think about all the people you talk to when you're going through a crisis. Think about the depth of those conversations. And now imagine you're going through one of the most difficult times of your life, and the entire support system is stripped away. No one to run to, no one to talk to. This is the reality of life for many people experiencing homelessness. When I've sat down to talk to people on the streets, I've often been surprised at the personal nature of those conversations. And I've realized over time that they don't have the convenience of hiding behind any walls, emotional or otherwise. Their lives are out in the open for us to see. They have no choice but to be vulnerable. This is crucial to remember when we connect with people on the streets. The reason I wrote the letter to Devin was the same reason I would express appreciation to anyone, a friend who shared deep, intimate, personal details of their life struggles with me. Few people want to live on the streets, but people of all stripes, young and old, introverted and extroverted, are thrown into situations where they are forced to rely on strangers to survive. When we go into their space, we should recognize that we are not giving them our time or giving them our attention. We're sharing a space with another human being and seeking to understand a piece of their story, and maybe sharing a bit of our own in response. Once we leave that space, we should recognize that we should thank them for their willingness to open up to us and to teach us. Giving someone money, giving them food, talking to them, that's all great, but the how is just as important as the what. These are people too, and they deserve the same dignity and respect that we would show to a friend. Now, this is not a solution in and of itself, but the mentality can change lives. Yes, of course, if everyone in the US gave $5 to charity today, the world would be a much better place tomorrow. But if everyone in the US spent 5 minutes of their day connecting with someone in need, the world would be a better and more empathetic place, far beyond the next day. This distinction exemplifies the importance of including solidarity as a core part of our charity work. Think about it this way. You could go into a community and say, this is what you need, and then give them what you think they need. Or you could go into a community and ask, what do you need, and how can I help you get it? And then work with them toward that goal. Solidarity adds a dimension of reciprocity to charity work. Why is that important? Well, solidarity allows people on the other side of social issues to speak their own truths, so our service is properly guided. It gives them empowerment to help themselves in the future. And it allows us, as outsiders, to learn from people of drastically different backgrounds. But what does it look like in practice? Well, here's Diane once again. Today, she lives in a beautiful home, has a stable job, and sings with the choir every week. Her life has changed dramatically from when she was living on the streets. And it's all because someone decided to look at her as a human being. That someone, in this case, was actually two people, Nina Deering and Steph Johnson, who founded the Voices of Our City Choir in 2016. While doing homelessness outreach in the San Diego community, they realized that many members of that community were musicians. They were guitarists and singers and drummers, and they valued the talent and passion of those people simply because they were talented and passionate. It had nothing to do with their living situation. Once they chose to connect with people on the streets as human beings, something incredible happened. The Voices of Our City Choir was born. It's now become an incredibly successful nonprofit that runs weekly rehearsals and performs all around San Diego with dozens of regular members. 32 choir members have been able to get into housing through resources provided by the choir, and many of them, including Diane, have started to work for the choir. Once people were given the opportunity to use their voice, to lift themselves up, and to build a community where so little hope often exists, they took it. All it took on our part was to see them as equals, as capable, powerful people. Homelessness is a humanitarian crisis of massive proportions, and looking at the statistics alone can be disheartening and desensitizing. But before you leave this room, take just a moment to reflect on the immense power you have as an individual to empower those who are so often overlooked by our society. It's true, any change at all can go a long way, but if all of us leave this room and only one person acts, not much will happen. But imagine the power of a whole auditorium full of people who commit to connecting with those on the streets. Imagine a whole school full of people who dedicate themselves to humanizing those they once overlooked. Imagine a whole world full of people who recognize that the suffering of one of us is the suffering of all of us. Instead of asking you for donations, I'd like to challenge you to do something else with the money in your wallet. If you can, take a few spare dollars that you might not need and find someone else who might need them more. But instead of just dropping that money at their feet or handing it over, try to talk to them. Try to connect with them and try to learn from them. And see how that affects them and see how it affects you. Maybe it will change your day. Maybe it will change your life. But if you never try, you'll never know. Thank you.